You're tuned in to Ghost Frequency. Tonight, we step into the dark veins of Colorado, a state praised for its beauty, but stained by encounters that locals speak of only in hushed tones. These 9 true stories are pulled from real reports, archived records, and first-hand testimonies from those who made it out, changed. Names and small details have been concealed for protection, but the core truths remain intact. Colorado is where many go seeking peace and open skies. After this, you may never look at its lonely roads and forgotten towns the same way again. Case had never put much stock in ghosts. Not until the autumn he started working maintenance for Denver Parks and Recreation. It was a temporary gig, a stopgap, just enough to cover rent while the echoes of his dropped college courses faded. 22, with hands calloused from honest labor and a mind sharp with skepticism, he found a certain comfort in the predictable rhythm of groundskeeping. Rake the leaves, trim the hedges, clear the paths. Simple. Tangible. No room for the supernatural nonsense his grandmother used to whisper about in the quiet dark. Cheeseman Park became his dominion that October. 40 manicured acres stretched across Capitol Hill like a verdant carpet, dotted with walking paths, vibrant rose gardens, and a grand pavilion that offered sweeping views of the Denver skyline. By day, it hummed with life joggers, dog walkers, families picnicking beneath the wide-armed trees. But Case preferred the stillness of dawn, when the park belonged only to him and the small maintenance crew. The dew still clung to the grass, and the shadows stretched long and silent, like sleeping giants. His supervisor, Rick, a man weathered by 2 decades in Denver's parks, caught Case on his first day at Cheeseman. Near the shed, Rick pulled him aside, his voice a strange blend of jest and gravity. "This place has history, kid. Just keep your head down, do your work, and don't go digging too deep." A dry chuckle escaped Rick's lips, but his eyes held a glint that unsettled Case. "Some of the old-timers swear this place is haunted. Just talk, of course. But if you see anything weird, you come find me. All right?" Case nodded, dismissing it as initiation banter. Every new job had its folklore. He wasn't about to fall for it. The first week slipped by uneventfully. Case learned every curve of the walking paths, every thirsty patch of rose garden, every sprawling expanse of lawn that seemed to defy the very laws of growth. The pavilion, a magnet for tourists, demanded constant attention, its gleaming facade masking the hidden work beneath. But it was the seemingly endless acres of central lawn where Case spent most of his days, pushing the mower, lost in the roar of the engine. It was during his second week that he first saw them, subtle depressions in the grass. Each was roughly 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, scattered across the main field without any discernible pattern. Barely visible, unless you knew precisely where to look. But once Casey spotted one, he began to see dozens, then scores. Faint scars on the earth, refusing to heal. He brought it up to Rick, who offered a curt, almost dismissive answer. "Ground settling, old irrigation lines probably. Don't worry about it." Yet Rick's gaze darted away, and Case noticed the older man's careful avoidance of those sunken patches as they walked. A prickle of unease, sharp and insistent, began to needle at Case. That evening, propelled by a curiosity he couldn't shake, Case found himself at the Denver Public Library. What he uncovered about Cheeseman Park sent a cold shock through him, tightening his stomach into a knot. The park, he learned, had once been Mount Prospect Cemetery, Denver's first official burial ground, established in 1858. For decades, it had been the final resting place for thousands, pioneers and paupers, criminals and victims of disease, all interred during the city's wild frontier days. By the 1890s, the cemetery had fallen into disrepair, ignored, and overgrown. Headstones crumbled, graves lay untended, and the booming city decided it needed the prime real estate. Citizens were given 90 days to relocate their loved ones. But for the vast majority, those with no family, no money, no one left to claim them, their final slumber was about to be brutally interrupted. The city hired an undertaker, a man named E.P. McGovern, for the grim task of disinterment. His fee, $1.90 per coffin. What McGovern did next was the stuff of nightmares. He saw not a sacred trust, but an opportunity for monstrous profit. Child-sized coffins were cheaper, so McGovern began to hack apart the bodies, cramming pieces into smaller containers, maximizing his earnings with grotesque efficiency. Limbs, torsos, skulls, they were scattered across open graves, a macabre feast for curious onlookers, some of whom even began pilfering the exposed remains. The operation was so horrifying, so utterly devoid of respect, that the health commissioner eventually shut it down. But not before hundreds of graves had been desecrated. The remaining bodies were never removed. The city simply filled in the open graves, smoothed over the earth, and built a park on top. An estimated 2,000 corpses still lay beneath the manicured grass, their eternal rest disturbed by the greed and incompetence of those sworn to honor them. Casey closed the library book, his hands trembling. Those depressions in the lawn weren't irrigation lines, they were graves. He had been walking over a massive, unhallowed burial ground for 2 weeks. The next morning, Cheeseman Park felt different. Every step Case took felt heavier, each shadow seemed to lengthen, to deepen its reach. The cheerful facade of the park had shattered, replaced by the chilling knowledge that thousands of forgotten souls lay just feet beneath his boots. He tried to focus on his tasks, but his gaze kept drifting to those telltale depressions. Some were more pronounced. He couldn't help but wonder what that meant. Were some graves deeper? Were some bodies more restless? It was during his lunch break, seated on a bench near the pavilion, a sandwich untouched in his hand, that he first heard them. Voices, distant conversation, just at the edge of hearing whispers, really. He scanned the empty park. He was alone. But the whispers continued, rising and falling like wind through unseen leaves, though not a breath of air stirred the trees. He stood, tilting his head, trying to pinpoint the source. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a disembodied murmur drifting across the park like an audio mirage. Too faint for individual words, yet an undeniable urgency pulsed beneath them, a plaintive quality that prickled his skin. After several long minutes they faded, leaving only the distant hum of traffic and the hollow beat of Case's own heart. He told himself it was imagination, a trick of the mind after the library revelations. But deep down, he knew. He knew what he'd heard. The dead were trying to speak. In the days that followed, the incidents escalated. Tools would vanish from the maintenance shed, only to reappear hours later, placed neatly in the center of a grave depression, as if borrowed and returned to mark a specific spot. Case's work boots would sink deeper into certain patches of grass, the earth somehow softer and more yielding over what he now recognized as burial sites. On calm days, inexplicable cold spots would manifest, pockets of Arctic air that made his breath visible, with no meteorological explanation. The other maintenance workers began to avoid certain sections of the park after dark. Miguel, a 15-year veteran, flat out refused to trim the bushes near the rose garden once the sun dipped below the horizon. "There's something moving in there," he'd told Cass one crisp morning, his voice low. "Not animals, something else, something that watches." Sarah, the newest hire besides Case, quit abruptly after a single shift in the pavilion area. She offered no explanation, simply gathered her tools, her face pale, her hands trembling. Rick, ever the stoic, merely shrugged. Happens sometimes, he muttered. This place isn't for everyone. The breaking point arrived on a gray Thursday morning in late October. Case came in early, preparing for a busy day of leaf removal. A storm the night before had scattered branches and debris across the park. He was raking leaves from around the memorial benches when something on the main lawn caught his eye. The depressions. They were more vivid than he'd ever seen them, outlined in white frost that had collected in the sunken earth, stark against the dark grass. From his vantage near the pavilion, Case saw dozens of rectangular shapes etched perfectly in white against the dark green. A blueprint, a chilling map showing precisely where the bodies lay. The sight was both terrifying and strangely beautiful, as if nature herself was revealing the park's buried secrets. He was so absorbed, so lost in the spectral tableau, that he almost missed the figure. A man in dark clothing, standing perfectly still in the center of the field, among the frost-outlined graves. Casey blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks. The figure stood tall, an anachronism against the freshly mown grass, his back to Kassane's pavilion. He wore what seemed an antique suit. "Hey!" Kassane's voice cut through the morning stillness, a little too loud, as he dropped his rake, starting across the dew-kissed lawn. "The park's not open yet." The man didn't stir, didn't acknowledge the intrusion. As Kassane closed the distance, details sharpened. The suit wasn't merely old-fashioned. It was a relic, the formal wear of a bygone century, perhaps even a burial shroud. The man's posture was unnervingly stiff, rigid as a mannequin posed by hands that had never felt the warmth of living skin. At 50 feet, the figure pivoted. What Kassane saw stole his breath. Not a face, but a shifting, blurring suggestion of one. Hollows, impossibly dark, where eyes should have been. A mouth that stretched too wide, too eager. Skin the color and waxy translucence of something unearthed, something that had endured too long beneath the earth. A skeletal hand, decomposed and spectral, rose slowly, pointing a crooked finger directly at Kassane. Terror locked his muscles, a cold vice around his throat. His mind screamed for escape, but his body remained a statue carved from fear. The apparition lurched forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a marionette dancing to an amateur puppeteer's clumsy strings. Then, from the frost-rimmed depressions across the lawn, other shapes began to stir, pulling themselves from the soil with a physics-defying grace. Men, women, children, all bearing the unmistakable watermark of long burial and violent, untidy dismemberment. The whispers returned, no longer indistinct, but sharp, chillingly clear. "Remember us," they chanted in unison. "We are still here. We are still here. We are still here." The first ghoul was close enough now that Kassane could smell it, the sickly sweet scent of decay, a corruption so profound no embalming could ever truly mask it. A guttural scream tore from his throat, echoing across the empty park, a sound that was both a prayer and a curse. The shriek broke the spell. His legs found their purpose. He ran, blindly, toward the maintenance shed. Behind him, the murmurs swelled into a wail, the forgotten dead demanding their due. He didn't look back, fumbling for his keys, his hands shaking so violently they could barely grip the metal. He sat in the truck, shivering, until Rick and the crew arrived a full 20 minutes later. One look at Kassane's ashen face, and Rick simply nodded. "You saw them, didn't you?" Kassane could only manage a silent nod. Rick sighed, leaning against the vehicle. "Happens to most of us, sooner or later. This place, it ain't right. Those people buried here, they never got the respect they deserved. McGovern chopped them up like firewood, scattered their pieces, left them to rot in open graves. That kind of disrespect leaves a mark." "Why didn't you warn me?" Kassane rasped. "Would you have believed me? Rick asked, his eyes distant. You had to see for yourself. That's how it works. They spent the rest of the morning working in pairs, a silent pact to avoid the main lawn where the frost had etched the hidden blueprint of the cemetery. By noon, the sun had erased the frost, and the grave depressions faded back into subtle undulations in the earth, imperceptible to those who didn't know where to look. Kassain finished his shift, but he knew he couldn't come back. That evening, he typed his resignation, sending it before doubt could creep in. A week later, he found work at a shopping mall across town. Indoor work, artificial lights, no hidden graves. Yet on quiet nights, when the wind howled, he still heard whispers. And sometimes, walking through other parks, other patches of grass, he'd spot depressions in the earth, too regular, too purposeful to be natural. Denver, an old city, built on layers of history many preferred to forget. But the dead remembered. They always remembered. Kassain never returned to Cheeseman Park, but he often thought of the 2,000 souls still beneath the manicured lawn. Did they appreciate the flowers, the laughter of children? He hoped so, for some debts he now understood could never be fully paid. Some secrets refused to stay buried. Jury had always been drawn to the chilling logic of true crime, but she never imagined her genealogical sleuthing would unearth one of Denver's most disturbing cold cases. A freelance genealogist, she specialized in tracing fractured family trees through dusty archives, piecing together lives from brittle records. It was a detective's work, a quiet satisfaction in solving puzzles left unfinished for generations. The Peters case surfaced during a routine property search. A client, eyeing a house on West Moncrief Place, a quiet residential street in northwest Denver, wanted its history. The property had languished for months, despite a competitive price, stirring her client's suspicion of a darker past. Jury agreed, expecting only a mundane trail of foreclosures, not the shadow she was about to step into. What she discovered in the Denver Public Library archives shattered her comfortable notions of home and the nature of evil. The nightmare began on October 17th, 1941. Philip Peters, a 73-year-old retired railroad worker, was found brutally bludgeoned in his own kitchen. A concerned neighbor, finding him absent for their regular evening meal, had made the grim discovery. The puzzling detail: no forced entry. Every door, every window locked from the inside. Not a single trace of an intruder. Peters lived alone. His wife, Helen, was recovering from a broken hip at Denver General Hospital. Their adult children had long since moved on. The house on Moncrief Place was modest, neat, an embodiment of the quiet middle-class dreams cherished by an older generation. Peters had spent 40 years on the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, saving enough to buy the home, to live out his retirement in peace. The murder weapon lay near the body, a heavy iron stove shaker, a tool for clearing ash. It was covered in blood, strands of hair. The coroner's report was stark: multiple ferocious blows, far more than necessary to kill. Whoever had done this had been consumed by a raw, unbridled rage, or perhaps a terror beyond comprehension. The initial investigation stalled. No suspects, no clear motive. Peters was described universally as a quiet, pleasant man without enemies. His finances were stable, not extravagant. Nothing was stolen. Every interview, neighbors, friends, family, yielded nothing. No one could fathom who would want to harm the gentle retiree. As jury delved deeper, the mystery only deepened. Helen Peters returned home after her hospital discharge to the house where her husband had been murdered. Almost immediately, unsettling events began. Food vanished from the kitchen. Footsteps padded overhead when she swore she was alone. Objects shifted, lights flickered on and off. The housekeeper Helen hired quit within 2 weeks, terrified, claiming the house was haunted. She spoke of disembodied voices, darting shadows in her peripheral vision, an unwavering sense of being watched. Neighbors, too, began to notice. Lights in the Peters house would burn at odd hours. A fleeting glimpse of a figure in an upstairs window when the house was known to be empty. Eventually, Helen Peters moved to western Colorado to live with her son, unable to endure the suffocating dread of her former home. The house stood vacant, but the strange reports persisted. Patrols found nothing concrete. Jury found a gaping hole in the official record. The murder in October 1941, yet no significant developments until July 1942. 9 months of silence. Then, abruptly, the case closed. An arrest, a confession, Theodore Edward Coney's. The circumstances of Coney's capture were almost as bizarre as the murder itself. On July 30th, 1942, 2 Denver police detectives on a routine check of the vacant Peters house heard a faint clicking sound from the second floor. Tracing it, they found a small trapdoor in a closet ceiling. As they investigated, they glimpsed 2 legs vanishing into the attic space. Grabbing the legs, they pulled, dragging down a man so emaciated, so filthy, they initially mistook him for a vagrant. Theodore Coney's, nearly 6 feet tall, weighed barely 75 pounds. The torn and stained clothes, the matted hair, the skin pale as a cave fungus. These were the first things that struck them. But it was the attic crawl space, no larger than a coffin, barely enough to lie down, impossible to stand, that truly froze the blood of the officers. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, clung to every surface, and the air was heavy with the stench of human waste. This was where Theodore Coney, a ghost in his own flesh, had made his lair. Empty food containers, scattered like fallen leaves, told the story of pilfering from the kitchen below. Old magazines, creased and worn, lay testament to endless, confined hours. A small electric toaster, a pathetic sun, had been his only warmth against the Denver winter. A detective, reeling from the sight, muttered that a man would have to be a spider to survive such conditions. The newspapers, hungry for sensation, eagerly devoured the quote, christening him the Denver Spider-Man. Under the harsh glow of interrogation lights, Coney confessed not only to the murder of Philip Peters, but to a chilling 9 months of secret habitation within their shared home. His story, a tapestry of quiet horror, haunted jury for years, unraveling her most basic assumptions about privacy and sanctuary. Born in 1882, Theodore Coney had been a fragile child, not expected to see adulthood. His mother, a suffocating shield, had inadvertently stunted his social growth, leaving him adrift in a world he simply couldn't navigate. Intelligent yet awkward, lacking the grit for consistent work, he drifted city to city, job to job, a perpetual outsider. By September 1941, Denver was just another stop, a desperate hope to reconnect with a fleeting acquaintance, Philip Peters, from the old guitar club. Coney intended to ask for a modest loan, a lifeline. But the Monreef Place house was empty when he arrived. Instead of returning later, an impulse, dark and unbidden, led him to break in and wait. The house, with its quiet comfort and stocked pantry, felt like an unexpected haven. When Peters still hadn't returned by nightfall, Coney explored and found it. A trapdoor in a closet ceiling, leading to a maintenance space, never meant for a human. Yet something in its dark, cramped embrace called to him. For the first time, he felt utterly safe, unseen, unheard, untouchable. No judgment, no rejection, just shelter, food, and absolute privacy. He decided to stay. For 5 weeks, Coney lived like a phantom in Peter's own home. He became a shadow, learning Philip's habits, his schedule, when he walked, when he visited his hospitalized wife. He emerged then, raiding the kitchen, using the bathroom, stretching his cramped limbs. It became a perverse game, a test of his invisibility, pushing the boundaries of detection. Sometimes he'd follow the old man from room to room, just out of sight, a silent predator reveling in his unseen power. The game shattered on October 17th. Peters, stirring from an afternoon nap, came to the kitchen for water and froze. Coney stood at the refrigerator, brazenly helping himself. Shock gave way to rage. Peters grabbed his walking cane, striking out. Coney panicked. He claimed he never intended harm, but the attack ignited something primal. He seized an iron stove shaker, a heavy blunt weapon, and kept striking long after the old man fell. Years of simmering resentment, of all he yearned for but could never have, erupted. When it ended, Philip Peters was dead. Theodore Coney faced a choice: flee or stay in the only place he'd ever felt truly at home. He chose the latter for 9 long months. Coney remained in his attic nest, a silent observer as the investigation swirled below. He listened as Helen Peters, returning from the hospital, recounted the strange occurrences, dismissed by others as spectral hauntings. He overheard police conversations, piecing together details of the case, details no one suspected he possessed. He was there when the terrified housekeeper quit, convinced the house harbored a malevolent spirit. And, in a chilling way, it did not a ghost, but a living man, a spider in the shadows, feeding on scraps and silence. Jury found Coney's story more profoundly disturbing than the violence itself. The notion of someone living undetected within a home challenged her very foundations of safety and privacy. How many times had she felt secure in her own solitude, never imagining unseen eyes watching from within the walls? Coney was eventually convicted, sentenced to a different kind of confined space, dying behind bars in 1967. The Monreef Place house changed hands, but the specter of the Denver Spider-Man clung to it like a stubborn stain. Real estate agents learned to omit the name, yet the story always found a way to surface. Jury's research culminated in a meticulous report filled with newspaper clippings, police records, and court documents. Her recommendation was clear: find another property. Not for supernatural fears, but for the indelible psychological weight history could imprint on a place. Some stories once rooted simply cannot be erased. Her client, acknowledging Jury's thoroughness, wisely bought elsewhere. The Peters case subtly altered Jury. New locks appeared on her doors and windows, not from fear of conventional break-ins, but from the chilling realization that the deepest threats could emerge from within. She began checking her attic and basement with unsettling frequency, searching for signs of an unseen presence. The Denver Spider-Man had taught her that the line between victim and predator, hunter and prey, was terrifyingly thin. In the intimate confines of a home, invisibility could stretch for months, even years, a silent vigil awaiting the moment of revelation. The truly frightening predators, she realized, didn't smash doors. They found ways to inhabit the perceived safe spaces, parasitic, feeding on security itself. Jury never researched another Monreef Place property, refusing cases tied to violent pasts. Some mysteries, she concluded, were best left in the dark, too disturbing to exhume. The Denver Spider-Man belonged in his web, in the murky spaces between the walls. Malia had always been a skeptic, steadfast in her scientific approach to the paranormal. But that was before 3 solitary nights in the Peabody Whitehead mansion. As a freelance investigator, her equipment bag hummed with EMF meters, digital thermometers, and night vision cameras. Yet her sharp, analytical mind was her true weapon. She'd debunked more hauntings than she'd ever validated, earning a reputation for unvarnished truth. The call came from a property management company, struggling to fill the historic Grant Street mansion. Converted to office space, it was hemorrhaging staff. Phones rang with no caller, elevator doors opened and closed to empty floors, unseen footsteps echoed in silent corridors. Several employees had simply walked out, unnerved by the constant, unseen gaze. Desperate, the manager hired Malia to investigate. Her task: distinguish natural explanations from genuine supernatural activity. Proof of the latter meant a sale. Debunking the claims would lead to her recommendations for addressing the psychological and environmental factors fueling the unease. Malia arrived on a bleak November afternoon, the heavy cases of her equipment a stark counterpoint to the imposing red brick mansion. Built in 1889, the two-story Victorian, though weathered by time and renovations, still held a grandeur that hinted at forgotten secrets. The windows, tall and dark as eyes behind their wrought iron filigree, were framed by ornate stonework that spoke of an age when craftsmanship was a sacred vow. Inside, Marcus, the property manager, a man whose nerves seemed to vibrate just beneath his skin, practically shivered as he handed over the keys. "Most of the activity," he began, his voice thin and reedy as they moved through the cavernous entrance hall. "It's on the second floor. The office is up there. Highest turnover rate. People complain about feeling watched, hearing things, shadows that move on their own. We've had 3 cleaning crews quit in 6 months. Malia nodded, her pen scratching against her notepad, camera clicking softly as Marcus ushered her through the meticulously restored mansion. Hardwood gleamed underfoot, molding flowed like frozen lace, and period fixtures cast a warm, if somewhat subdued, glow. She could almost picture it bustling during business hours, a pleasant hum of productivity. But in the late afternoon, with Marcus's hurried whispers echoing off empty walls, an oppressive weight settled in the air, a silence with teeth. The second floor, the heart of the disturbance, had once been the master bedroom suite. Now partitioned into 3 offices, it still, impossibly, retained a ghost of its former intimacy, even beneath the stark modern lighting. This was the chamber where Dr. William Whitehead, a Civil War surgeon, had lived, and ultimately died. Tormented by the phantom screams of soldiers he couldn't save, men who had withered under his care despite his most desperate efforts. "He built this place after the war," Marcus explained, leading her through the troubled space. "But he never found peace here. Records say he was haunted by his patients, still in their bloody uniforms, walking the halls at night, looking for a treatment he could no longer provide. After Dr. Whitehead's death in 1902, the mansion became a revolving door of owners. In the 1950s, a restaurant tried its luck, and that's when the new whispers began. Glasses shattering without touch, books leaping from shelves, unseen hands brushing against skin. The restaurant failed. Every venture thereafter met the same fate, strangled by the unsettling atmosphere and the relentless tide of departing employees. Malia established her base in the main hall, her equipment laid out like an operating theater. She knew most paranormal phenomena peaked in the early hours, when the veil between sleep and waking stretched thinnest. Her plan: 3 nights, 3 different sections, meticulous documentation, and an unwavering search for rational explanations. The first night was a blank canvas. She stationed herself in the former dining room, now a stark conference space, her instruments a silent chorus of anticipation. Only the normal symphony of an old house settling, the distant urban sigh, and the lonely wail of a siren broke the quiet. Her cameras recorded empty rooms, her audio captured nothing but the ghost of wind whispering through ancient vents. The second night, the air itself seemed to thicken as Malia moved her equipment to Dr. Whitehead's former study on the second floor. A weight pressed against her, a sorrow so palpable it felt like a physical presence. Around midnight, her EMF meter pulsed erratically, jumping from baseline to violent spikes without discernible cause. Then, at 2 a.m., the footsteps began, measured, rhythmic, echoing from the hallway outside the study. She glanced at her night vision monitor. Empty. Yet the sound continued, a relentless tread. Grabbing her digital recorder, Malia followed, but the footsteps seemed to dance just ahead, always around the next corner, behind the door she'd just passed. They led her through a labyrinth of converted offices, past modern partitions that the unseen walker seemed to ignore, charting a path through the mansion as it had existed in Dr. Whitehead's time. With each step, Malia felt it, the air growing colder, heavier, charged with a profound, desperate grief. In her periphery, shadows danced, forms that might be human if she dared to look directly. Finally, the footsteps halted in the warren of offices that had once been the master bedroom. Malia set up her camera, the silence that followed brittle, as if the very walls held their breath. Her digital thermometer plunged 15 degrees. Her EMF meter screamed, a violent spike that made her wonder if it had finally malfunctioned. Then, the whispers. A man's voice, urgent, too low to decipher, yet undeniably human, seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, a chorus of hushed conversations. Her recorder captured it, but playback was a garbled, distorted mess. For an hour the activity reigned. Temperature drops, electromagnetic chaos, audio phenomena defying all logic. Her cameras remained stubbornly blind. As dawn bled through the tall windows, the disturbances receded. Whispers faded to silence. Temperature and EMF readings stabilized. Malia stood alone amidst her equipment, a profound and chilling realization settling in her bones. She had documented something genuinely paranormal. The third night, armed with the knowledge that the former master bedroom was the epicenter, Malia spent the entire night there, her equipment arranged in a watchful circle. The phenomena began earlier, around 11 p.m., with subtle shifts in temperature and air pressure. The patterns of the previous night returned, amplified. The whispered conversations were louder, more frequent, almost seeming to respond to her presence. At midnight, the air shimmered, and a translucent figure solidified near the phantom hearth. A man, etched with an almost unbearable grief, in the blood-stained uniform of a Civil War surgeon. Dr. Whitehead. For a breath, their eyes met across the chasm of a century. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Then others materialized, spectral soldiers in tattered uniforms, some broken, others bearing the gaping wounds that had claimed them. They stood in silent accusation, their gazes fixed on the surgeon who had failed them. Dr. Whitehead moved through the room, frantic, futile, as if still treating invisible bodies, his face twisted in a desperate battle against death itself. The soldiers watched, motionless, silent. Malia understood. They were not malevolent, but echoes of a profound guilt, the embodiment of a conscience that could never forgive itself for its human limitations. The truth dawned on Malia, not through her instruments, but through a chilling, intuitive clarity. This was no mere residual haunting, no intelligent spirit. It was a psychological torment so potent, it had imprinted itself into the very fabric of the building. Dr. Whitehead's death had not freed him. His guilt had become part of the mansion, manifesting as the sights, sounds, and sensations that mirrored his eternal struggle. The raw mountain wind scoured Ilara's face, carrying with it not just the scent of pine and frozen earth, but the persistent chill of grief that clung to the place. She found herself an unwilling confidant to the long-dead Dr. Alistair Peabody. The weight of his impossible burden settled over her, a crushing empathy that explained why his spirit could not rest. Each patient lost was a brand on his soul, a personal failure etched deep, regardless of the brutal, undeniable truths of Civil War medicine. Saving everyone hadn't just been difficult, It had been a physical impossibility. As dawn bled pink across her last morning in the mansion, Ilara packed her equipment. Her hands moved with a heavy, unbidden sadness. She held irrefutable proof of paranormal activity, yes, but more profoundly, she now understood the raw, human tragedy that coiled beneath it. Dr. Peabody wasn't a malevolent specter or a soul tethered by some forgotten task. He was trapped in a psychological amber, a perpetual loop of guilt and regret that even death had failed to sever. Her report to the property management company was meticulous, yet infused with an unexpected tenderness. The mansion was undeniably haunted, she confirmed, but the phenomena were not menacing. These manifesting spirits were not harbingers of harm, but victims of their own agonizing emotional patterns. Still, she appended, the psychological toll on staff, irrespective of their understanding, would persist. The property, she concluded, carried too much human sorrow to ever feel truly safe. The mansion eventually traded hands, reborn as residential apartments. Prospective tenants, forewarned of its spectral residents, made their choices. Some, drawn by a melancholic curiosity, found the ghostly presences more poignant than frightening. Others, however, fled its halls, unable to bear the constant, subtle echoes of human suffering and unabsolved guilt. Ilara never truly left those 3 nights in the Peabody mansion. The experience was a crucible that reforged her approach to the unseen. The most potent hauntings, she learned, were not born of malice, but from agonizingly human emotions, stretched thin across the veil of death. Some suffering, she realized, was so profound, so unyielding, that it transcended life itself, twisting environments into crucibles where the past refused to lie buried. The mansion endures, a magnet for the curious and the professional alike. Yet those who linger often depart with Ilara's somber epiphany. It is haunted not by malevolent entities, but by the aching echo of a good man, unable to forgive himself for being starkly, painfully mortal. In his world, success was measured in lives saved. Dr. Peabody's defeat was not a failing of skill, but the simple, unyielding truth. Sometimes, death is stronger than any medicine, and some wounds, no matter how desperately one tries, can never truly heal. Crew had inhaled the story of Emma Crawford's coffin with the thin mountain air of Colorado Springs, a local legend he dismissed as colorful folklore until the winter he became a groundskeeper for Manitou Springs Cemetery. It was the kind of tale parents spun to amuse children on long drives through winding canyons. A woman, buried high on Red Mountain in 1889, her coffin, decades later, torn from its resting place by a storm and sent careening down the slope, and the subsequent whispers of a phantom. Most treated it as charming regional trivia, a quirky detail for cocktail party chatter. There was no real bite to it. He was 24, desperate for stability, when the cemetery board hired him that November in 2019. The previous groundskeeper had vanished, citing psychological stress from working alone amidst the graves. The board, skeptical but relieved, snatched Crew up, grateful for anyone willing to brave the harsh winter when maintenance became a bleak, solitary ballet against the elements. The cemetery clung to a hillside, offering an unobstructed vista of Manitou Springs below and the dramatic rise of Red Mountain to the west. Old Harold, the supervisor, walked Crew through his orientation, pointing out landmarks and daily rhythms. When they reached the section closest to the mountain's base, Harold paused, his voice dropping into a casual undertone, weighted with something more. "You'll hear about Emma Crawford sooner or later," he said, a vague gesture towards the looming slopes. "Woman buried up there in the 1800s. Coffin came down in a mudslide years ago. Some folks say she wanders, looking for a proper resting place. Nonsense, of course. But if you see anything, Unusual. You just let me know. Crew offered a polite nod, filing Harold's words away as the expected local color. A harmless ghost story, he thought, one that lent a place character without genuinely chilling the blood. Old wives' tales held no sway over him. His first month unfolded in quiet rhythm. Winter in the mountains brought its own solemn beauty and stark trials, snow to be cleared, ice gripping the steep paths. But the work, in its solitude and purpose, was satisfying. Crew relished the still mornings, alone with the gravestones and the breathtaking panorama, tending to the physical needs of a space consecrated to memory. Emma Crawford's grave, he learned, had been an arduous ascent, accessible only by a switchbacking trail. Her burial, even for 1889, was singular. A delicate young woman from the East Coast, she journeyed to Manitou Springs, seeking solace from tuberculosis in its famed hot springs. As her life ebbed, she made a final, fervent plea. To be interred on Red Mountain, a place where she had found fleeting peace. Her fiancé, a man of profound devotion, honored her impossible wish. Laborers had carried her coffin by hand, hacking a grave from the stubborn rock. For 12 years, Emma slept undisturbed, marked by a simple wooden cross, cradled by the wild beauty she adored. But the mountain possessed its own brutal will. In 1912, a vengeful union of heavy spring rains and melting snow unleashed a catastrophic mudslide. Tons of earth roared down the slopes, obliterating trails, tearing trees from their roots, and sweeping everything in its path towards the valley. Emma's coffin, dislodged from its precarious hold, joined the chaotic descent. Locals later found splintered pieces of the wooden box scattered across the lower slopes, but Emma's remains had vanished. Some whispered of Crystal Creek, others of her body entombed beneath untold tons of mud and stone. The incident became a grim fascination, fodder for newspaper headlines and local lore. More disturbing than the lost burial, however, were the sightings that followed. Hikers spoke of a woman in a white dress, always moving upward along the mountain trails as if perpetually seeking her violated grave. The apparition, they claimed, materialized most often during storms, when the elements mirrored the day her rest was so brutally disturbed. Crew absorbed these fragments of history during his first month. Visitors occasionally inquired about Emma. Old-timers recounted their versions of the tale. Most treated it as benign history, but a handful spoke with the chilling conviction of those who had witnessed something unexplainable on the mountain slopes. Then, in December, the first true incident occurred. A heavy snowfall blotted out the trails, making the mountain a treacherous wilderness. Crew was alone, clearing snow from the cemetery roads, preparing for the holiday visitors. The rhythmic shoveling generated a welcome warmth against the biting cold. As the afternoon deepened and the snow intensified, he sensed a movement on the trail leading up Red Mountain. Through the swirling white, a figure emerged, a woman in light-colored clothing, steadily ascending despite the dangerous conditions. Concerned, Crew called out, but received no response. He dropped his shovel and started towards the trailhead, intending to warn her. But when he reached the point where the path began its climb, the fresh snow lay pristine, undisturbed. There were no footprints, nothing. Only the seamless, virgin white. Turning back, he could see his own boot tracks clearly etched in the snow, a stark contrast to the untouched mountain path. Crew stood for several minutes, scanning the swirling white for any sign of movement. The snow continued to fall, visibility blurring, but there was no trace of the woman. Eventually, he returned to his work, rationalizing it as an optical illusion, a trick of the light and snow. Yet the image lingered, and he found himself glancing repeatedly towards the mountain. The cemetery felt different now, charged with a subtle awareness that hadn't been there before. as if his brief sighting had awakened something dormant, drawing its veiled attention to his presence among the sleeping. Over the following weeks, similar incidents began to occur with unsettling frequency. The wind-whipped figures danced on Red Mountain's trails, a ghostly ballet in weather that should have banished any living soul. Elias Thorne, the cemetery's stoic caretaker, had seen this pattern before. A woman, impossibly dressed in light fabric, always climbing, always vanishing the moment he tried to close the gap. It was a cruel taunt, a whisper of a presence that always eluded grasp. Then came the small impossibilities. Tools, left in their familiar places, would migrate to the edge of the Red Mountain Trail, as if an unseen hand nudged them, a silent guide pointing towards the peak. Flowers, solemnly placed on graves, were later found scattered along that same winding path, arranged in cryptic patterns that defied wind or wild animal. But the true chill settled with the dawn. As Elias unlocked the cemetery gates, distant voices would drift down from the mountain, too fragmented for words, yet undeniably human. A plaintive, urgent quality in their cries prickled his skin, a desperate plea echoing through the cold morning air. This chilling repetition drove Elias to the archives, to the faded newspaper accounts of the Emma Crawford case. What he unearthed only deepened the unsettling connection. In 1912, after the catastrophic mudslide, local papers had reported a chorus of voices from Red Mountain. Search parties found no survivors. For years, the mournful calls persisted, always during bad weather or seismic tremors, eventually dismissed as environmental acoustics. Yet now, a century later, Emma's legend seemed to stir, interwoven with Elias's daily life like a spectral vine. The climax arrived with the biting grip of a January storm. Icy winds shrieked through the pines, and snow swirled into a blinding maelstrom as Elias braved the pre-dawn gloom to inspect the cemetery. His breath plumed in the frigid air as he moved between the silent headstones, when a sound, impossibly clear, pierced the storm's roar. A woman's voice from Red Mountain spoke words even the wind couldn't snatch. "Help me," it pleaded. "I cannot find my way home." A primal dread seized Elias, but the raw human anguish in the repeated plea ignited something deeper. Someone was trapped. His duty, his humanity, eclipsed the creeping suspicion that this was no ordinary emergency. He snatched his emergency kit and a powerful flashlight, then plunged into the blizzard-choked Red Mountain Trail. The path was treacherous, a slick ribbon of ice and drifting snow, but the voice, always just ahead, drew him upward. It seemed to emanate from the very spot where Emma Crawford had been interred, high on the slope where the earth had swallowed her hopes a century ago. The ascent became an hour-long ordeal of straining muscle and bated breath. The calls continued, guiding him through the swirling white, an urgent, spectral siren. But as he climbed higher, the words softened, dissolving into wordless cries that began to blend with the wind's keening lament. Finally, he reached a small clearing, a huddle of stunted pines, an ancient, wind-sculpted rock. The storm began to wane, the snow easing to a gentle fall, offering a fragile clarity. Elias searched, his voice hoarse against the lingering gusts, but found nothing, no living soul. Then, half buried in a snowdrift near the clearing's edge, he saw it. A piece of dark, weathered wood, intricately carved, echoing 19th century craftsmanship. It could only be from a coffin. As Elias's gloved hand closed around it, a faint vibration pulsed through the wood, a charge of unseen energy. The wind, which moments before had raged, now died to an absolute stillness. In that profound silence, the voice returned, closer now, imbued not with desperation, but with pure, profound relief. "Thank you," it whispered. "Now I can rest." Elias never heard the voice again. The spectral woman vanished from the trails. The mischievous rearrangement of tools and flowers ceased. The cemetery settled back into its familiar, quiet rhythm. He kept the piece of wood in his shed through the long winter, a silent sentinel of his strange encounter. With the first breath of spring, when the mountain trails unfurled again, Elias carried it back to the clearing, burying it carefully in the rocky soil. He understood then that some stories, some spirits, remain tethered by unfinished business, by simple human yearning. Emma Crawford had sought peace on Red Mountain, a peace denied by nature's fury. Elias, by returning a fragment of her journey home, had closed a circle ruptured over a century ago, offering her the recognition and final rest she'd been denied. The living, he realized, sometimes serve as silent conduits for the dead, guiding them home through the permeable veil between worlds. Joy had always scoffed at the supernatural, until her family moved into their dream home, nestled amidst the towering ponderosa pines of Black Forest. 5 acres of secluded bliss, a wraparound porch overlooking a vista of jagged peaks, and endless green for their twin boys, Caleb and Connor. To roam it was everything they'd ever desired after years of cramped suburban life. The realtor had mentioned the previous owner's sudden, bargain basement departure, but Joy and Marcus dismissed it as a financial hiccup. The house was immaculate, recently renovated, a jewel in one of Colorado Springs' most coveted communities. They considered themselves blessed. The first week dissolved in a flurry of unpacking and decorating, the boys initially thrilled by their new rooms and the forest stretching beyond their windows. But then came the whispers, literally. Caleb and Connor began complaining of footsteps in the hallways when everyone else slept, the creak of doors opening and closing, and hushed conversations drifting from empty rooms. Joy and Marcus chalked it up to adjustment anxieties and the natural symphony of an older house. Raccoons on the roof, wind in the pines, they reasoned, installing nightlights and reassuring their sons that all old homes had their quirks. By the 3rd week, however, Joy began to experience phenomena that defied easy explanation. While cooking dinner, she'd hear distinct footsteps directly above her, even if Marcus and the boys were outside. Lights flickered with a deliberate rhythm, beyond the randomness of electrical glitches. Cold spots materialized in rooms, her breath fogging in the sudden chill, even when the rest of the house hummed with warmth. Most unsettling were the voices. Late at night, as the family slept, a faint murmur of conversation would float through the stillness. The words eluded her, but the cadence was unmistakably human. She would rise, heart thrumming, checking every room, every switch, finding nothing but silence where the voices had been. Marcus, ever the skeptic, remained unconvinced until one night the phenomenon claimed him too. They lay in bed, the quiet shattered by the unmistakable sound of their front door opening and closing, followed by deliberate footsteps moving through the living room. Terror clawed at them. Marcus grabbed a baseball bat and descended, while Joy, her fingers trembling, dialed 911. They found the front door securely locked from the inside, the security chain still taut. Every window was latched, no sign of forced entry. The police arrived swiftly, searching the house and darkened property with professional thoroughness, but found nothing. Not a trace of an intruder. Only the lingering, icy silence of a house that held its secrets close. The first call from the Black Forest area was always the same. A new resident, rattled, convinced something unseen lurked in their walls. Sergeant Davies, a man carved from 70 years of Colorado granite, had heard it 100 times. "Just the wildlife, ma'am," he'd murmur into the phone, or the wind through the pines. But lately these calls had begun to twist into something else, something colder than the mountain air, more persistent than any coyote's howl. Jovi, a pragmatist by nature, initially chalked it up to the unfamiliar quiet of their new mountain home. Then came the kitchen cabinets, groaning open in the dead of night, their wooden jaws snapping shut with a percussive clap that stole sleep and frayed nerves. The boys, wide-eyed and pale, whispered of shadow figures tall, impossibly thin drifting past their bedroom windows, always just out of focus, yet undeniably human in their silent passage. Electronics flickered, a silent disco of disembodied power. Even the old baby monitor, forgotten in a storage box, crackled to life, spitting out fractured sentences in languages Jovi couldn't place. The house, once a dream, was becoming a cage of whispers and half-seen things. Desperate, Jovi turned her restless energy to research, poring over the history of their idyllic plot in Black Forest. What she unearthed coiled a knot of unease in her stomach. The land, she discovered, had once been sacred ground to several indigenous tribes, a place where some historians claimed the veil between worlds thinned. More unsettling were the documented accounts of other families in the area, stories that mirrored her own chilling experiences. A shiver traced her spine when she found the Lee family's saga. In the early 90s, just a few miles from their new home, the Lees had endured a maelstrom of paranormal activity so extreme it had drawn national attention. Television crews, researchers, the whole spectral circus. The Lees' encounters were a chilling echo of Jovi's reality. Inexplicable lights, disembodied voices murmuring in empty rooms, sudden Arctic blasts in a sun-drenched hallway, and the constant suffocating press of unseen eyes. Their torment was meticulously documented. Photographs, unsettling video footage, all deemed authentic by seasoned paranormal investigators. The Lees, desperate for peace, had poured over $70,000 into psychics, mediums, and scientific experts, chasing an answer that perpetually flickered just beyond their grasp. The true horror of the Lee case, however, lay in its root. Their property sat squarely on what indigenous spiritual advisors called a rainbow vortex, a place where the Earth's raw, power-intense geological activity, underground springs, mineral deposits, conspired to unravel the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. It was an ethereal crossroads, a perpetual whisper from beyond. Jovi presented her findings to Marcus, who, ever the skeptic, still felt the gnawing anxiety that settled over their home like a persistent fog. He agreed. Something had to be done. A local paranormal investigation group, renowned for their work in the Black Forest's spectral hotspots, became their last hope. David and Sarah, a husband and wife team, arrived one Saturday afternoon, their van overflowing with scientific equipment. They moved with a quiet, respectful efficiency, explaining that Black Forest harbored the highest concentration of reported paranormal activity in Colorado, attributing it to the very geological and spiritual confluence Jovi had discovered. For 2 nights, their house transformed into a silent laboratory. EMF detectors screamed in sudden bursts where the cold spots settled. Digital thermometers plunged, marking a chilling 20-degree drop in localized pockets, only to return to normal moments later. But it was the audio recordings that truly stunned them. Sensitive microphones, left running in the boys' now empty bedrooms, picked up a chorus of whispers, indistinct yet undeniably conversational. When David and Sarah posed direct questions, the silence would deepen, then erupt in a surge of activity, as if the unseen presences were conferring, deliberating. On their second night, in the boys' room, the investigators captured what they deemed undeniable communication. Simple questions yielded chillingly appropriate responses. "Are there children here?" Sarah asked into the hushed darkness. The recorder, retrieved minutes later, played back a faint, ethereal chorus. "Yes, here." Then, The question that hung heaviest in the air. Do you mean us harm? The answer, faint but unmistakable, was a unified, resonant no. David and Sarah concluded. The house was undoubtedly active, but the entities seemed more curious than malevolent. They theorized these were the lingering echoes of former residents, deeply connected to the land, trying to coexist. Their recommendations were disarmingly simple. Acknowledge the spirits, speak to them, set boundaries. Many families, they explained, found peace by simply asking for it. That evening, Jovi gathered her family in the living room. Her voice, steadier than she felt, addressed the empty air. We're grateful to share this beautiful home, she began, but we need to establish some rules. Please, no more frightening the children. No more disturbances at night. The response was immediate. That night, the house was utterly silent. The oppressive tension lifted like a morning mist. The boys slept soundly. Over the coming days, the paranormal activity softened. It didn't vanish, but it became a gentler presence. Lights flickered briefly in daylight. Soft footsteps padded through unoccupied rooms. The terrifying nighttime intrusions were gone. Jovi learned to coexist, seeing the spirits not as a problem, but as an intrinsic part of the home's character. She began leaving small offerings, flowers, a bowl of fresh fruit, a gesture that seemed to be acknowledged by the house's continued peaceful hum. The boys, remarkably resilient, started calling them their ghost friends, weaving them into their imaginative play. They'd hold one-sided conversations with empty corners, sometimes reporting uncanny warnings about a loose floorboard or an open cabinet. Marcus, though still the family's anchor to logic, couldn't deny the palpable shift in the house's aura. The initial dread had been replaced by a strange, quiet camaraderie. Jovi realized the supernatural wasn't always a force of malevolence, but often a gentle, lingering presence. 5 years later, her family still shares their Black Forest home with its unseen residents, an arrangement that feels as normal as morning coffee. Some houses, she understood, came with more than just architecture. They came with stories, and the boundary between life and what lay beyond was far less absolute than most assumed. The Black Forest continued to draw new families, but longtime residents knew its beauty concealed more than just wildlife and weather. It held secrets whispered on the wind, a testament to the fact that here, the supernatural was as natural as the towering pines themselves. Meanwhile, Jacine Parrish thrived in the quiet solitude of cold cases. She was a freelance investigative journalist, a hunter of forgotten truths, who pursued the kind of mysteries police departments eventually shelved when the scent grew cold. Specializing in Colorado's unsolved crimes, she'd earned a reputation for unearthing overlooked evidence, bringing closure to families who had waited years, sometimes decades. Her methodical approach, her willingness to camp out in remote locations for weeks, had already solved 3 missing-person cases and put 2 complacent murderers behind bars. The Mount Cutler case landed on her desk through a hushed tip from Jerry Hoffman, a retired park ranger who'd patrolled the Cheyenne Mountain State Park system for over 30 years. Jerry had carried the weight of an incident from 1987 for decades, a discovery that had slipped through the cracks of jurisdictional confusion and bureaucratic indifference, haunting him like an unfinished melody. The cold tendrils of a 3.5-decade-old secret had found a voice. Elias Vance, haunted by the memory of a grim discovery, saw his chance for absolution in the news of Detective Serafina Dubois' relentless pursuit of justice in similar, long-dormant cases. It was October of 1987, when he'd been deep on Mount Cutler, performing a routine inspection, that the mountain had yielded its gruesome secret. Far from any hiking path, in a remote, forgotten pocket of wilderness, Elias stumbled upon human remains. The site was a still life of horror, severely decomposed, partially burned, and unmistakably bound. Rope marks scored what remained of the wrists and ankles, painting a chilling tableau of pre-mortem struggle. Identification was impossible then, but one stark truth resonated. This was no natural death. Elias had done the right thing, contacted the Colorado Springs police, but the bureaucratic labyrinth began its slow, suffocating work. The discovery was on federal land, a jurisdictional no-man's land between local police, the county sheriff, and federal authorities. For months, the remains languished in storage while papers shuffled and blame shifted. By the time a proper investigation was greenlit, nature had reclaimed the scene, weather and wildlife erasing vital clues, turning forensic analysis into a ghost chase. The case was quietly shelved, probable homicide, unidentified victim. A missing piece in a puzzle no one seemed eager to solve. Elias's periodic calls yielded nothing but the stale echo of inactive status, lost among thousands of cold files. When Serafina finally pulled the original reports, the lack of real police work was a stark, almost infuriating blank space. The discovery site never properly processed. No systematic search for personal effects, scattered fragments of clothing, or other telltale clues. The cause of death listed as undetermined, despite the obvious screaming evidence of murder. But the most galling oversight was the victim himself. A forensic anthropologist had pegged him as a male, 25 to 35 years old, roughly 6 feet tall, with a telltale old break in his left arm. This vital information had never been cross-referenced with missing person databases. No attempt at facial reconstruction, no public appeal. The man had been forgotten twice over. Serafina, a quiet fury burning in her, declared the Mount Cutler case her own. This wasn't just a professional undertaking. It was a personal crusade, using her own resources to conduct the investigation that should have been launched 3 decades prior. Her first step, revisit the scene. Elias Vance, a man who had meticulously documented the exact location despite the official file's vague geographical references, became her guide. The hike was brutal, hours of scrambling through dense forest and treacherous rocky outcroppings, a path clearly designed to repel casual wanderers. Elias led her to a small, secluded clearing, ringed by tall pines, a natural amphitheater of concealment, invisible from any established trail. The remoteness spoke volumes. Someone familiar with the land, someone deliberate, had chosen this spot, ensuring discovery was an act of purest chance. Even after 35 years, Serafina's trained eye, sharper than the initial investigators in their haste, picked up overlooked details. Borrowing a metal detector from a local archaeology group, she swept the underbrush. The device sang, unearthing small personal artifacts, a leather watch band with distinctive tooling, a brass belt buckle gleaming with a turquoise inlay, and, most crucially, a Colorado State University class ring, 1984 engraved inside. These were not just objects, they were whispers from the past, the first real leads this case had ever breathed. She contacted the alumni office at Colorado State, requesting a list of 1984 graduates matching the victim's description. 12 names emerged. The painstaking process of tracking each one began. 7 were quickly eliminated, alive or deceased from documented natural causes far from Colorado. 3 others had left the state, maintaining contact with family, too visible to have simply vanished. The remaining 2 were harder to trace, but one name resonated like a tuning fork: Robert Mitchell. Robert, a Colorado Springs native, had graduated CSU in May 1984 with an environmental science degree. He'd returned home, joining a local consulting firm specializing in mining impact assessments. His family remembered him as an avid hiker and rock climber, a true son of the mountains. But what truly electrified Serafina was the other detail: Robert had been reported missing by his roommate in October 1987, the very month the remains were found on Mount Cutler. This report, however, had been filed with the El Paso County Sheriff's Office. The body discovery, conversely, landed with Colorado Springs Police. Two separate official bodies, two separate reports, a chasm of bureaucratic incompetence separating them. No one had ever connected the dots. Serafina's dive into the missing person file cemented her theory. Robert's height and build perfectly matched the forensic anthropologist's profile. Medical records confirmed a broken left arm from a high school climbing accident, an eerie echo of the bone fragments found on Mount Cutler. The class ring, a tangible link, was confirmed by Robert's sister. He had worn it constantly. Robert Mitchell had been found. Now, the chilling why. Robert's work at the environmental consulting firm involved sensitive investigations into potential contamination at several mining sites. His findings had often put him at direct odds with powerful business interests, entities who stood to lose millions if environmental violations were prosecuted. One case in particular screamed motive. Robert had been testing soil and water at a copper mine, a suspected polluter, illegally dumping toxic waste into a stream that fed Colorado Springs' drinking supply. His preliminary results were devastating: serious contamination, demanding costly remediation, and potential criminal charges against the mine's owners. Serafina unearthed the critical detail. Robert had been scheduled to testify before a grand jury about his findings in November 1987, mere weeks after his disappearance. His testimony would have meant indictments, multi-million-dollar penalties, and prison sentences. With Robert silenced, the environmental case withered, lacking expert testimony. The mining company had walked free. The pieces clicked into place, forming a dark mosaic. The mining operation's business interests intertwined with known organized crime figures, individuals notorious for using violence to protect their assets. Phone records from 1987 revealed threatening calls to Robert in the weeks before his disappearance, calls he'd reported to his supervisor, but which had never been properly investigated. Serafina compiled her findings into a meticulous report, a damning indictment of past failures, delivering it to both the Colorado Springs Police Department and the FBI. Her evidence was irrefutable. Robert Mitchell was murdered to prevent his testimony. She named names, identifying individuals with ties to the mining company and histories of violence as potential suspects. In 2023, 36 agonizing years later, the case was officially reopened. Most of the original suspects were dead or infirm, beyond the reach of justice, but the renewed investigation unearthed further corroboration. Former mining company employees, their consciences stirred by the relentless detective, provided testimony about the threats Robert had endured and the chilling celebration among executives when his testimony evaporated. More immediately, the reopening brought solace. Robert Mitchell's remains were finally identified and properly buried. His family, after decades of agonizing uncertainty, held a memorial service, laying him to rest, a small, profound piece of closure for a tragedy that had scarred them for so long. The Mount Cutler case became a stark lesson. Some mysteries don't require advanced forensics, but sheer, stubborn, methodical police work, the kind that should have been done the moment Elias Vance stumbled upon the silent, burned bones that cold October morning. The biting Colorado wind, a ghost itself, often whispered secrets through the rugged peaks, secrets of triumphs and tragedies, of lives woven into the very fabric of the mountains. For Jacine, her latest victory, the unraveling of the Mount Cutler enigma, wasn't just a professional coup. It was a chilling reminder that too many human stories remained buried, not by an absence of truth, but by a failure to unearth it. Robert Mitchell's fate was but one thread. Her success had rippled outwards, drawing a tide of cold cases from across the state, each a silent plea from families haunted by years of unanswered questions. She had proven that resolve, sharp and unyielding, could resurrect even the oldest crimes, offering a delicate bloom of hope where only desolation had reigned. Across the state, in the opulent shadow of the Hotel Colorado, a different kind of specter stirred. Sincere, a doctoral candidate in American Studies at the University of Colorado, considered herself immune to such phantoms. She had arrived in November 2019, armed with the rigorous methodology of a scholar, her skepticism a shield against the whispers of the past. Her dissertation, a meticulous exploration of Victorian-era hospitality architecture, demanded an intellectual dissection of grand hotels like this 1893 Gilded Age marvel. She sought the bones of social interaction, the sinews of cultural expectation, not the spectral folklore that clung to ancient stones. From its massive red sandstone facade, crowned by a distinctive clock tower, to its elegant Italian Renaissance lines, the Hotel Colorado had once vied with Europe's finest resorts. It had lured titans of industry, European nobility, and presidents to the famed Glenwood Springs hot springs. A century and a quarter of continuous operation had layered history upon history within its walls, making it a living archive for Sincere's research. The management, perhaps sensing her academic rigor, had been remarkably accommodating, granting access to dusty ledgers and architectural blueprints, even an exclusive room on the 4th floor of the original building. This section, they'd explained with a practiced smile, retained the most authentic period features, perfect for her work. What they conveniently omitted was that this floor also served as ground zero for the hotel's most persistent and unsettling claims of paranormal activity. Her first 3 days flowed with the quiet hum of academic discovery. Mornings were spent in the hushed archives, sifting through guest registers and construction notes, piecing together the resort's evolving narrative. Afternoons were a ballet of lens and light, capturing intricate architectural details, punctuated by interviews with long-serving employees, their voices repositories of the hotel's past. These records unveiled a hidden life beyond luxury. During the Great War, the entire 4th floor had been transformed into a military hospital, a sanctuary for wounded soldiers. The legendary hot springs, lauded for their curative powers, became a beacon of hope for those grappling with the physical and psychological scars of combat. At the heart of this makeshift infirmary was Dr. Catherine Morrison, a pioneering head nurse. Her employment records, crisp and precise, placed her in room 447 during her tenure, a resolute figure who poured her formidable intellect and boundless compassion into the care of nearly 300 men between 1917 and 1919. Her detailed medical notes, a blend of clinical observation and profound empathy, painted a picture of a woman who often logged 18-hour days, sometimes collapsing into sleep within the hospital itself rather than retreating to her own quarters. Then, in January 1919, the Spanish flu, a silent assassin on the wind, stole Dr. Morrison. Despite her battle-hardened resilience, she succumbed within a week. Newspaper clippings, yellowed with time, spoke of a community in mourning, of veterans, the beneficiaries of her unwavering care, lining the streets for her memorial. Sincere absorbed these details as academic data points, fragments of historical context, not premonitions. Her focus remained on the cold logic of architecture and social history, not the echoes of personal tragedy. The shift began on her 4th night. A subtle rupture in the meticulously ordered world Sincere had constructed. At precisely 3 a.m., a woman's voice, soft and insistent, seeped through the silence of her room, followed by the measured tread of footsteps in the hallway. Annoyed, Sincere dismissed it as a late-night guest or a maintenance worker. She pulled the covers tighter, but the sounds persisted for an hour, a maddening loop of whispered words, then footsteps, then a brief, unsettling hush. The voice held a peculiar duality, urgent, yet somehow comforting, as if a quiet instruction or reassurance was being offered to an invisible recipient. Curiosity, a more potent force than her desire for sleep, eventually unseated her from bed. She peered through the peephole, expecting to see a hotel employee or a guest absorbed in a clandestine phone call. The corridor was empty, bathed in the dim glow of wall sconces that stretched long skeletal shadows across the patterned carpet. Yet, the sounds continued, a phantom presence moving from one end of the hall to the other. She heard them, clear as a bell, but saw nothing. Retreating to her bed, she rationalized. Old hotels, especially those of grand scale, were notorious for acoustic deceptions, carrying sounds from distant rooms or floors. The next morning, a casual mention of the incident to Margaret, the hotel archivist, drew an immediate, knowing stare. "You were in room 447 last night, weren't you?" Margaret's voice was calm, almost anticipatory. When Sincere confirmed the room number, the archivist nodded slowly. "That's Dr. Morrison's room. You heard her making her nightly rounds." Margaret explained that these spectral footsteps, this comforting whisper, were a recurring theme for guests on the 4th floor. The phenomenon was so commonplace, it had its own established explanation within the hotel. Dr. Morrison, still checking on her patients, a century after her last breath. "She isn't frightening or malevolent," Margaret assured her, a soft smile touching her lips. "Most guests find her presence rather comforting once they understand who she is. She seems drawn to people under stress or dealing with illness, offering the same gentle care she once provided." Sincere's skepticism was a lifelong companion, but the idea, however fantastical, held an odd allure. A caring presence, drawn to those burdened by stress, like a doctoral candidate grappling with financial pressures and familial obligations, was not without its appeal. Her final night transformed the academic abstraction into a visceral encounter. Working late on the nascent chapters of her dissertation, a sudden wave of malaise washed over her. A fever surged, her head throbbed, and a debilitating weakness made even clear thought an effort. Fearing a serious illness, perhaps the flu, she called the front desk, asking about nearby medical facilities. Before the hotel staff could respond, a soft, deliberate knock echoed from her door. She opened it to an empty hall, save for a small basket sitting silently on her threshold. Within the basket lay a collection of items chosen with uncanny precision. Herbal tea bags, throat lozenges, a small bottle of aspirin, and most remarkably, warm, damp washcloths, as if just wrung out. Beneath these, a handwritten note, penned in an elegant script of an earlier era, offered detailed instructions for treating her symptoms. It recommended specific teas for reducing fever, precise intervals for aspirin dosage, and directions for applying the warm compresses to her temples. The language, the medical terminology, all belonged to the early 20th century. Yet, the recommendations were medically sound, precisely what her ailing body craved. Following the ghostly prescription, Sincere brewed the tea and applied the warm compresses. Within an hour, the fever began to recede, the headache's fierce grip loosening. By morning, she felt steady enough to complete her packing and check out. When she recounted the improbable incident to Margaret at the front desk, the archivist simply smiled, a quiet knowing in her eyes. "Dr. Morrison." The old hotel whispered tales, but it was Dr. E.B. Ilara Morrison, who often offered tangible, if spectral, aid. "She's known for providing medical help," Margaret explained, her voice tinged with both awe and familiarity. "Dozens of reports over the years. Guests fall ill, and what they need, precisely what they need, materializes outside their door, accompanied by instructions steeped in the medicine of her era. Margaret fanned out a collection of fragile notes, their script identical, elegant, and filled with advice both historically accurate and eerily practical. The hotel hoarded these, not as relics, but as living documents in its archives, chronicling an ongoing conversation between past and present. 4. Dr. Sincere Albright. This fundamentally shattered her academic armor. History, in her trained mind, resided in dusty texts and museum glass. Yet, Dr. Morrison transcended that, suggesting historical figures could cling to the very spaces where their lives had bloomed. Sincere's dissertation, once rigidly framed, now unfurled to embrace a new chapter, the persistent presence of the departed. Her advisor, initially a skeptic, found himself swayed by the sheer weight of evidence gathered at the Hotel Colorado. The spectral nurse's note, authenticated by handwriting experts as early 20th century script and validated by medical historians for its era-accurate advice, became the keystone, proving the past could influence the present in ways that defied conventional analysis. Her finished dissertation, Persistent Presence: How Historical Figures Continue to Shape Contemporary Spaces, was a quiet bombshell, braiding traditional historical research with documented paranormal phenomena. Sincere argued that places like the Hotel Colorado weren't just historical sites, but living bridges where the dedication of figures like Dr. Morrison still flowed, a current of care benefiting a contemporary world. The hotel, in turn, embraced her findings, weaving them into tours and marketing, even offering historical presence packages. Rooms marked by documented activity, inviting guests to touch the continuing influence of its spectral physician. Sincere understood then that academic rigor wasn't compromised by openness to the unconventional. It was deepened. Years later, as a professor herself, she continued charting the confluence of history and the spectral, convinced that the most profound truths weren't solely etched in records, but in the enduring presence of those who had devoted their lives to serving others, a historical continuity that transcended even death itself. Meanwhile, Emberly Thorne found her own intersection of history and the uncanny not among academic papers, but under stage lights. As venue manager for Fort Collins's Aggie Theater, her love for music history and theater management found a professionally rewarding, if occasionally unsettling, home. Since 1924, from vaudeville to indie, the Aggie had been a crucible for northern Colorado's music scene. Emberly, steeped in the venue's rich legacy, hadn't anticipated that the legacy embraced performers who had never truly left the stage. The Aggie, a distinctive brick edifice on South College Avenue, was a landmark in itself, its Art Deco facade and vintage marquee a beacon in the downtown cultural district. Inside, exposed brick, polished hardwood, and a raised stage hummed with nearly a century of echoes. It swallowed 650 standing patrons, creating an intimacy that artists and audiences alike found electrifying. 6 months into her tenure, Emberly encountered what the old-timers called residual activity. It was a Tuesday evening in October, late, the hour stealing away the last traces of daylight as she updated booking calendars. Then, faint but unmistakable, music drifted from the main theater, a piano melody, a woman's voice singing tunes from the 1940s. Assuming a sound check or an unauthorized rehearsal, Emberly moved from her office, drawn by the sound. The main floor was a cavern of shadows, house lights off, only the single bare bulb of the ghost light illuminating the stage. Yet the music swelled as she entered, emanating from nowhere. The piano was covered, locked. The sound system powered down. No one visible, that was. The melodies persisted, rich and live, suspended in the empty air. Emberly stood rooted in the middle of the dark theater, listening to an entire song performed by invisible artists. The voice, clear and professional, carried the trained vibrato of a seasoned jazz singer. The piano, sophisticated and confident, hinted at a virtuoso's touch. When the final note faded, Emberly's voice, tight with a thrill of unease, sliced through the quiet. "Hello? Is someone here? The theater's supposed to be empty." Her words seemed to hang, then dissipate into a silence unlike any other. A charged emptiness that prickled her skin. A thorough search yielded nothing, no rogue equipment, no hiding figures. But smaller, stranger details emerged. The air in the theater was noticeably colder, distinct from the building's ambient warmth, yet the heating hummed normally. It felt like the air before a show, thick with anticipation. Most unsettling was the stage itself, seemingly dressed for a performance that wasn't there. The ghost light cast dramatic, dancing shadows, hinting at unseen musicians, invisible instruments. And the very acoustics of the empty space resonated differently, as if responding to presences Emberly couldn't perceive. She relayed the incident to Jake, the sound engineer, a man who had navigated the Aggie's sonic landscape for 15 years. His reaction wasn't surprise, but immediate recognition. "You heard Melody," he said matter-of-factly. "She performs most Tuesday evenings, usually between 9 and 10. Sometimes she takes requests, if you ask nicely." Melody, Jake explained, was the theater's resident female spirit, identified by past employees' research as Melody Harrison, a jazz singer who had graced the Aggies stage throughout the 1940s and early 50s. She had been a rising star, known for her powerful voice and sophisticated interpretations. Her tragedy, the story went, was tied to the venue. In December 1951, on the night of her farewell performance before moving to Denver, she was found dead in her dressing room, a congenital heart condition, undiagnosed. 26 years old, a promising career cut brutally short. The poignancy of her end resonated through the decades. Her final show had been a benefit for Korean War veterans, a testament to her dedication to the community that had nurtured her talent. Attendees had called it the finest performance of her career. Local papers had immortalized both her triumph and her tragic demise, weaving her story into Fort Collins musical folklore. Jake and the staff assured Emberly that Melody's presence was benevolent, drawn to quiet evenings when she could perform without disrupting scheduled events. Tuesdays, her lifelong performance night, were her most active. In the weeks that followed, Emberly began to acclimate, her routine slowly incorporating Melody's spectral performances. The soft, almost imperceptible hum of the empty theater was a familiar companion on Tuesday evenings, a sound Emberly had come to cherish. Ostensibly, she stayed late to wrestle with administrative tasks, but her true purpose was far more ethereal, to listen for the spirit's performance. The music, always exquisite and flawlessly rendered, would fill the cavernous space with melodies from the Great American Songbook, each note a testament to Harrison's remarkable range and evocative interpretations. Their connection deepened when Emberly, prompted by a particularly soul-stirring piece, began to speak directly to the uninhabited seats. "That was a beautiful melody," she'd murmur, her voice carrying across the velvet expanse. "Thank you for sharing your gift." And in those hushed moments, a response would often come, another song, seemingly chosen just for her, a whispered affirmation from an unseen hand. It was an uncanny conversation, one that blossomed into a friendship of sorts, between Emberly and the spectral performer she'd come to call Melody. Melody, it seemed, possessed an acute sensitivity to Emberly's emotional landscape. When stress tightened its grip or difficult patrons cast a long shadow, comforting or uplifting music would drift from the stage. During one brutal week, as the theater grappled with technical meltdowns and demanding clients, Emberly arrived for her usual Tuesday solace. To find Melody had prepared an entire suite of optimistic, life-affirming tunes, each note a balm to her frayed nerves. But the phantom musician's most astonishing evolution was her growing awareness of the contemporary world. While her repertoire remained rooted in her own era, Emberly started to notice flashes of the present, a modern composition subtly reinterpreted as a 1940s jazz standard. It became clear that Melody had been silently absorbing the sounds of the living, expanding her musical lexicon across decades of stylistic shifts, a silent student in the echoes of her own past. The true testament to Melody's enduring presence, however, emerged during a benefit concert Emberly organized to fund local music education programs. The date, a Tuesday evening in December, marked the exact 72nd anniversary of Melody Harrison's final performance. Emberly hadn't planned it, but as the date drew near, the cosmic synchronicity was undeniable. During the afternoon soundcheck, a disquieting current ran through the Aggie Theater. Musicians, usually unflappable, complained of phantom feedback from microphones, instruments that stubbornly refused to stay in tune, and a mixing board that developed glitches even seasoned technicians couldn't unravel. The chaos escalated, threatening to derail the entire evening. Emberly, her stomach tight with dread, feared the show might be cancelled. With the audience filtering in, Emberly made a desperate, whispered plea. Alone on the stage, she addressed the empty air, her voice barely a tremor. "I know you understand what we're trying to do here," she implored. "This is just like your final concert, supporting the community, helping musicians. If you can help us make this work, I would be incredibly grateful." What transpired next became the stuff of legend, a story whispered for years within the Colorado music scene. The technical nightmares vanished. The acoustics became transcendent, each voice and instrument perfectly balanced, vibrating with an almost impossible clarity. Musicians later swore it was the finest they had ever sounded, infused with an energy and resonance that far surpassed their usual abilities. And then, the most remarkable detail, several audience members reported hearing additional voices, ethereal harmonies woven into the tapestry of the music, seemingly emanating from above and behind the stage. The concert recording confirmed it. Spectral backing vocals, impossibly perfect, complementing every song with the practiced grace of a seasoned professional. That night, the benefit concert shattered all previous fundraising records, but its true impact far exceeded mere monetary gain. The musicians spoke of a transformative experience, a reconnection with the spiritual core of their art. More than one artist specifically requested to be booked for future Tuesday evenings, drawn by the unique, almost palpable energy that now permeated the Aggie on those nights. Emberly's relationship with Melody deepened further, evolving into a silent, professional partnership. She began consulting the spirit on programming, seeking input on which artists might best resonate with the venue's particular atmosphere. Melody's responses, typically conveyed through carefully chosen musical selections, proved uncannily accurate, almost prophetic in predicting successful shows. The Aggie Theater began to cultivate a reputation, not just as a venue, but as a place where magic happened. Most patrons remained blissfully unaware of the spiritual collaborator, yet musicians consistently described playing there as a singular experience, superior acoustics, and an unusually engaged, responsive audience. For Emberly, managing a haunted theater became a testament to the unexpected. The supernatural was not a problem, but an asset, a wellspring of insight and support that enriched every performance. Melody Harrison's continued presence served as a profound reminder. death did not sever an artist's bond with their craft or community. The echo of the jazz singer lived on, nurturing new generations and ensuring the vibrant tradition of live music at the Aggie Theater endured. Emberly learned that some venues retain the spiritual essence of all who have graced their stages, forging a timeless continuity between past and present. The Aggie Theater, she realized, was haunted not by malevolent spirits, but by the accumulated passion and devotion of musicians who had discovered something sacred in the very act of sharing their art. Anakin did not believe in ghosts. Not until the stark winter he spent as a historical researcher for the Colorado Mountain History Initiative, meticulously documenting the skeletal remnants of mining towns devoured by the harsh winter appetites of the late 1800s. As a graduate student in American history at the University of Colorado, Boulder, his approach was strictly academic, skeptical, grounded in documented facts. His focus was the cold, hard logic of boom and bust cycles, not the whispers of folklore that often clung to these deserted settlements. The Independence Ghost Town project landed on his desk through his advisor, funded by a grant aimed at preserving the archaeological and historical significance of these camps before they vanished entirely. Independence, established in 1879, had been one of Colorado's highest mining strongholds, perched at over 10,900 feet near Aspen. At its zenith, nearly 1,500 souls had braved its brutal winters, lured by the promise of gold and silver. Its history was meticulously documented. Newspaper accounts, mining records, government surveys. The 1880s had seen Independence thrive. Mines buzzed, saloons roared, hotels offered respite, and businesses vital to a remote mountain community flourished. But the confluence of savage weather, dwindling ore yields, and the devastating silver panic of 1893 slowly bled the town dry, until only the most tenacious residents remained. What truly fascinated Anakin, the historian, was the winter of 1899. A series of colossal snowstorms had severed all access to the outside world for nearly 6 brutal months. The few dozen inhabitants who had chosen to stay were utterly isolated. No supplies, no communication. Many succumbed to the merciless cold, starvation, and disease before the snow finally receded enough for rescue parties to reach the silent, frozen settlement. Anakin's assignment was a 2-week deep dive, cataloging remaining structures, mapping the original town layout, collecting artifacts that might illuminate daily life within the camp. The Colorado Mountain History Initiative had arranged accommodations in a modern cabin, a well-appointed sanctuary near the original town site, used by researchers and the rare, determined tourist. It boasted solar power, a propane heating system, and enough provisions for an extended stay. Despite the high altitude and famously unpredictable weather, Anakin felt confident. He was a seasoned outdoorsman, well acquainted with the Rockies from prior research expeditions. His first week was productive, almost uneventful. He systematically surveyed the ruins, photographing and measuring stone foundations and collapsed timber frames, haunting vestiges of the substantial community that had once pulsed with life in this impossible locale. The town was clearly engineered, a main street slicing through a relatively flat expanse between towering slopes, residential areas terracing upwards, maximizing every precious foot of space. The skeleton of the hotel, the general store's gaping maw, the taverns where transient men once drowned their sorrows. Even in ruin, their purpose was clear. But it was the whisper of individual homes, smaller and more fragile, that truly snagged Anakin's attention. These weren't just structures. They were the last breath of families who'd gambled everything on a mountain's promise, a promise that had dissolved into thin air. He unearthed fragments, a child's wooden soldier, a scorched skillet, a tarnished locket, each a miniature window into a life once vividly lived. With each discovery, a deeper understanding of the silent courage and gnawing desperation that birthed this remote community, began to stir within him. Survival here, even with summer's grudging warmth, was a grueling calculus of food, fuel, and frostbite. To brave a winter? That was a wager with the very breath in your lungs. The stark truth of this gamble slapped Anakin across the face during his second week. A late-season storm descended like a wolf, its fangs of snow and wind tearing through the high country. He huddled inside his modern cabin, a fortress compared to their flimsy shacks, yet the howling outside painted a chilling portrait of what the original residents had endured. Trapped, the world beyond his window a white blur of fury, Anakin found himself unable to continue his outdoor survey. The enforced isolation, the complete severance from the outside world, no signal, no escape, began to chip away at him. For the first time, he grasped the profound, creeping psychological terror of being cut off, mirroring the crushing reality faced by the town's inhabitants in the brutal winter of 1899. And it was then, in the suffocating quiet between the wind's roars, that he first heard them. Voices. Faint at first, distorted, carried on the thin, frigid air. Too human to be wind, too clear to be imagination. Initially, he dismissed them, a trick of the acoustics, perhaps. Old buildings, high altitudes, the mind's desperate need to fill silence, all plausible explanations. But they persisted, even when the wind died down, weaving patterns too intricate for random echoes. They came from the town's husk, sometimes from a ghostly doorway, sometimes from the phantom path of what was once the main street. On his 10th night, with a fleeting lull in the storm, a chilling resolve settled over Anakin. He bundled himself, a lone figure against the towering snowdrifts, his digital recorder and powerful flashlight cutting twin beams into the inky blackness. The ghost town was transformed, a labyrinth of snow-shrouded monoliths, hinting at their former selves. The falling flakes muted the world, amplifying the profound isolation that had been a constant companion to those long-dead residents. As he pushed deeper, the voices sharpened. Multiple threads, weaving in and out, not panicked, but urgent like men and women forging impossible decisions under a sky that offered no mercy. And then, the most unsettling realization. They seemed to react to his presence. A halt in his steps, and the voices receded, only to resurface when he moved again, as if unseen dwellers were skirting his path, continuing their spectral work. The phenomenon culminated in the commercial district, amidst the snow-laden foundation stones of what had been the hotel lobby. Here, a complete conversation unfolded around him, men and women discussing ration counts, work details for stoking fires, even the desperate gamble of sending for help. The names dropped were starkly familiar, matching those painstakingly documented in the historical records of that lost winter. Every detail, from the dwindling medical supplies to the grim debates over who would brave the deadly mountain pass, echoed the harrowing accounts. Anakin stood, frozen by the spectral council, for almost an hour, his recorder capturing every chilling word. It was no hallucination. The recorder confirmed the undeniable presence of these voices. As the conversation reached its desperate zenith, detailing plans for a perilous journey for aid, a tide of raw emotion farewells, promises whispered into the void washed over him. Then, just as the snow began to fall heavier, a single voice, clearer than the rest, cut through the din, speaking directly to him. Tell them we tried. Tell them we did not give up without a fight. The storm raged for 2 more days, a fitting shroud for the revelations consuming Anakin. He devoured historical records, cross-referencing names, events, and desperate strategies. The voices had been no mere echoes. The very names he'd heard were of those who perished in the bitter winter of 1899. The survival tactics detailed in the ephemeral conversations mirrored precisely what rescue parties would later discover. The most heartbreaking confirmation: the planned expedition for help had indeed occurred, and 3 brave men had met their end on the mountain, their bodies found partway down the treacherous slopes. When the skies finally wept themselves clear, Anakin concluded his survey, his understanding profoundly altered. Independence wasn't merely a collection of decaying timber. It was a mausoleum of human spirit, a testament to the brutal cost of mining Colorado's dreams. His final report to the Colorado Mountain History Initiative included the requested archaeological data, yet its most compelling section detailed the unexplainable audio phenomena. He presented the recordings as compelling, if unconventional, evidence of residual haunting, the theory that emotionally charged events could imprint themselves upon a place, replaying under specific conditions. Initial skepticism from academics slowly gave way under the weight of the audio's clarity and its meticulous correlacy with historical fact. The Independence Ghost Town case became a landmark, pushing the boundaries of historical research. For Anakin, it was more than just a case study. The voices had given him a profound, personal link to the past. They were not data points. They were lives, resonating across a century, demanding to be heard not as footnotes, but as human experiences that still whispered in the wind. This paradigm-shifting encounter earned Anakin a new, distinct specialization: experiential historical research, blending traditional academic rigor with an audacious openness to the psychological and spiritual dimensions of vanished worlds. His work proved that certain historical truths remained locked away, accessible only to researchers bold enough to live taught the past, not merely study it.